Welcome back to Koine Corner. Today we're going to do something a little different. Instead of looking at a specific passage or vocabulary word, today what we're going to do is look at a question that I've been asked probably more than any other question regarding Koine, the New Testament, or the Bible in general. That question is, what English translation or what version is the best? That question is sort of like saying to someone, I'm having friends over for supper, what's the best way to cook? Or I'm doing a home repair project, what is the best tool? With the amount of information that's embedded in those questions, they're almost impossible to answer, right? So when we talk about what's the best version, it's a highly loaded question. It doesn't supply enough information about the user, and it leads me to explore a couple of different issues. First and foremost, today I'd like to talk about the philosophy of translation. What is it that guides a translator's work? And I'm going to look at it from the standpoint of three basic schools, one being the word-to-word philosophy. That means the translator's intent is to take each Greek word and as literally as possible in a one-for-one exchange, translate it as close as you can to the original text. That sounds like a no-brainer, right? I mean, wouldn't you want the most accurate, most literal word-for-word translation you could get? Well, that may be the case, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But bear in mind, all translation between any two languages involves a degree of subjectivity. The translator has to make some choices, informed choices, that guide how to take idia, turns of phrase, figures of speech, and make them make sense in the product language, in the end language. So it's not good enough to just take each and every word and drop down directly beneath it and do a literal translation of each word, because that may actually introduce more confusion than clarity. Which brings us to the second school, which is the thought-for-thought school of philosophy. So in my translation, I want to make sure that the reader gets the intended thought as best as I can translate it, as best as I can communicate it from the original text to the product text to this translated version. So if the literal phrasing is going to bring confusion, I want to smooth it, polish it, bring clarity through making sure that the thought is as clear as I can make it rather than just the word. This obviously involves a little bit more subjectivity than word-for-word translation, and it introduces a reality that all translators, all exegetes, all students have to contend with. When you're picking up a document that's 2,000 years old, you have to believe and understand that you are approaching it as a flawed human being with biases. One of my professors who taught both the language of Koine as well as exegesis, the work of interpreting and translating, said plainly, everyone has biases and you have to know what yours are. If you don't know what yours are, or if you're not willing to acknowledge them, they're going to influence your work in ways that are not faithful to the original text, and that's critically important. That becomes more of an issue when you go from word to word to thought, and it really becomes a big issue when we go to the third type, the third school of philosophy of translation. It's a pretty broad category, and I'm going to lump it into something I'm going to call amplification. Now, there is a Bible out there called the Amplified Bible, and also in this category I would include anything that's like a paraphrase, the Message, or the Living Bible, something that takes additional material, editorial content from the translators and uses it to try to make more sense to a modern audience of an ancient text. That's obviously a risky proposition because you are now superimposing, you're importing into the document material that didn't originally exist. And it's difficult, I mean, it's obviously not a word-for-word translation if you're bringing new words in. And it's difficult to say that it's a thought-for-thought translation because the amplifier, the paraphraser, is bringing some of their own thoughts in to try and add clarity. There's value to that, though. If you're someone who is unfamiliar with ancient history, with biblical history, you've not been exposed to the biblical text before in your life to any significant extent, and this all sounds quite alien to you because of the gap in time between when it was written and when you're reading it, you can benefit greatly from someone making a little informed commentary on what you're reading. But it's important to not ignore the risk of that. So if I don't know much about the timeline of the Bible, if I don't know the difference between the Babylonian exile and the Egyptian exile in the Old Testaments, or if I have no concept of the difference between Rome, Corinth, and Ephesus, if I don't know the difference between, say, chattel slavery in the early United States of America and the Greco-Roman slavery of the Hellenized world, I may draw conclusions, make assumptions that aren't accurate. A little guidance there can be helpful, but that amplification comes with pretty great risk. So how do I know which Bible, whatever Bible I pick up, how do I know what their philosophy of translation was? Well, there's great news. In virtually every Bible you've ever seen in your life, in the first few pages, there's an introduction. And in that introduction, the publisher, the translators, an amalgamation of both, they will set out as plainly as possible why they undertook this work, what the qualifications of the translating team was, what their philosophy was, what they hoped to capture. They'll tell you, we wanted to, as faithfully as possible, word for word, literally communicate what the Apostle Paul wrote to the Ephesians, etc. Or they may say, in modern times, people are turning away from reading the Bible because they can't connect with the languages in which they've heard it in the past, and we wanted to modernize the language and communicate the ideas, the thoughts of the original text as faithfully as we could. They'll tell you, and I think it's safe to believe what they tell you about their own intentions and purposes. Now, that doesn't mean that whatever they say, you should take that as definitive and you should stick to that one for the rest of your life. In fact, I think there's great value in looking at multiple versions. We have a great gift today called the internet. It's a double-edged sword. It's got a lot of curses along with it. But one of the blessings is you can read virtually every Bible version for free. And on some websites, you can pull up multiple versions right next to each other and compare translations and have a sense of how they dealt with it. Now, if you want to look at the closest you're going to get to word for word, and you have even just a little facility with Koine, you can look at an interlinear Bible, and you can usually see directly below the Greek word what the English translation of that particular translation team was, so that you'll know word by word how they made their decision. Then you can compare that to a complete version or versions and see how they line up and what the smoothness is there. Let's go back to what's best. What version is best? Well, I want to turn that on its head for a second and tell you what version is worst. The version that is worst is the one that you won't read. And let's say grandma or mom or dad or deacon so-and-so came to you and said, look here, the only real Bible is this one here. And you take that one home and you open it up and you quickly realize that you have to translate from the English in which this one is written to the English that you speak every day. And in that translation, you're struggling and you're not getting anything out of it. If you can't understand what you're reading, that's the worst translation for you. That doesn't mean it'll always be the worst translation. You may learn to comprehend that style of English better. You may develop over time a better grasp of the history and the context of things, and things will make more sense to you. You don't have to pick one and live with it for the rest of your life. But I guarantee you, you won't stick with it if you can't understand it. So the worst one is the one that you don't understand. There are passages in the New Testament that without some significant digging into some extra biblical histories and things like that, they sound crazy. There's a verse that encourages you to heap burning coals of fire on the heads of your enemies through prayer. And a person who doesn't have access to more information could easily be confused and twisted up about that, and I think you get the point. So back to cooking supper for your friends, what's the best way to cook? Or doing a home repair, what's the best tool? Well, what kind of home repair are you doing? Are you fixing a broken window? An impact drill is not going to be helpful. Are you cooking fish, or are you making tacos? Or are you making fish tacos? The way you cook is going to be dependent on what the outcome you're desiring is. It's kind of like that with looking at translations. Are you studying the New Testament for academic purposes? If that's the case, you're going to want to be as close to word for word as you can get. That's the whole reason we study ancient languages like Koine and Hebrew, because there's nothing better than being able to read Paul's words as he wrote them to understand what his original intent was, and to get closer to how his original audience would have understood those words. But if your purpose isn't academic, if it's devotional, you may say to yourself, I don't have the time or the inclination to learn this old language. Pardon the Westminster chimes as the clock has struck the hour. I don't have that inclination, so I'm going to turn to something that is word for word if I can understand it clearly. If it's confusing, I may go to something that's a little more thought for thought. And if I'm really struggling to get the meaning, I may pull in something that's been amplified so that I can see how others have thought about it. I don't have to do that though. I can go to commentaries, I can talk to friends, attend a Bible study that's covering that kind of material, and flesh out what it is that I'm looking at. Most importantly, that's an overstatement, not most importantly. Read for understanding. Try to make sure that you see as clearly as you can what the original author was writing to the original audience, because one thing is virtually certain. If I import my 21st century mores, values, and judgments onto this first century context of the original writer and the original audience, I will be virtually certain to make mistakes. The text is the source material. The judgments that we make have to be aware of and cognizant of the context in which it was written, or else we're going to bungle things up. Those are the biases with which we are all burdened. The only way to set them aside is through knowledge and through study and through discipline. Otherwise, we will be amplifying in our own minds by twisting things around and making it say something that it didn't. In upcoming episodes, we're going to talk a little bit more about what's the best version and some of the things that different versions are doing to modernize language and things like that. And we'll talk a little bit more about the kind of biases that affect translators as well as commentators and so forth. One last nugget before you go. Take a look at your Bible. At the beginning of each of the biblical books, is there an introduction? Is there a paragraph or two that tells you when this was written, by whom, to whom, what the occasion of the writing was, what prompted the writing, who was in charge at the time? Was this during a particular Roman emperor's reign? Was there a persecution taking place? Was there a famine? What was it about the city in which this is situated? Was it a rich city? Was it faced with a plague? What was going on? Knowing what was happening, I almost gave away something from the next time we're together, will help us to understand why the writer wrote what he wrote to who he wrote it. That's enough for today. And if you have found this helpful, please hit subscribe, share it with a friend, and I'll look forward to seeing you again on Koine Corner for our regular episodes as well as our Wednesday Word of the Week. And until then, charis kai irene humin, grace and peace to you.